Welcome to Zibby's Bookshop. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are very excited to celebrate Katherine Vaz book Above the Salt, and she's here in conversation tonight with Laura Warrell. It'll be about a 30-minute conversation. We'll open it up to a Q&A, and we have plenty of books to purchase, and we'll do a nice signing afterwards. So enjoy.
Good. Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Nice to see you. Katherine, I'm very glad to see you. Katherine and I have now known each other for a few years. I met you through my former editor, Lisa Lucas.
We have to talk about that.
We won't talk about that.
No. Or we will, but not.
We're going to talk about it after.
Yeah, we'll talk about it after.
But it's really great to see you. How's it going so far?
It's going great. And I think we met at a restaurant and we were trying to pinpoint, this is how long ago it was.
Yeah,
well, it wasn't that long.
2022.
2020. It was post-pandemic. It was coming out into the open.
Yeah.
And we had a nice dinner together.
We had a very nice dinner.
And we mutually know each other through Lisa Lucas, who was your wonderful editor.
Yes. Yeah. And you know how it is when you live in LA, you go to, well, for me, you go to a restaurant and then you never can go again because you have no idea where it is. I would love to know where that restaurant was. If you remember at some point,
this is a real New York answer. I can walk to it from the hotel where I'm staying. I don't remember the name of it. I just have my compass point where it is. So I'll find out for you.
Okay, find out. So it's very good to see you. So this is the lovely book, right? Above the Salt. Hopefully you've read it already. And if you haven't, you're going to learn a lot about it. I'm very excited to be here with you. Yeah. So do you want to maybe start by telling us what it's about for anyone who hasn't read it yet?
Sure. The capsule version, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Laura for doing this, and for Zibby Bookstore for having me. And Zibby did a podcast with me after doing one with my husband, Chris Surf, who, and she has this magical effect of bumping up your Amazon stats overnight, which is really nice.
Nice.
But so many dear friends, and my brother flew, it just surprised me. He flew down here from Northern California. And
where is he? Is this?
Boy, are my arms tired.
Yeah. But a lot of dear friends, and Leslie was one of my editors for the book when it was in a phase where I think the Thomas Wolfe expression was putting a corset on an elephant was the edit. Yeah. So anyway, thanks to all of you. And capsule version of it got pitched as, those comps they use, Love in the Time of Cholera meets Cold Mountain, which I thought was
good,
really good. And a very high bar, of course. But the capsule version is, I was giving a talk at the Library of Congress, and the Brazilian woman in charge of the Hispanic division was this wonderful devil who really wanted to promote Portuguese and Brazilian things because we were so outnumbered. So she said, there's an exhibit in the map room called the Portuguese Protestants of Illinois. I think you should see it. And we laughed because the Portuguese Protestants of Illinois was automatically funny.
Could be a band name too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And basically it's the story of American generosity at a certain time, which made it a good topic to write about. There were a group of perhaps up to 2,000 people on the Portuguese island of Madeira, which is very near Africa. And they were converted to Presbyterianism, violently driven off the island in religious riots. And after some wandering for a long time, absolutely destitute, they were adopted by Illinois. They were taken in, given free land and jobs, and during the time of Lincoln. And I came across a newspaper article of someone who, as an old man, returned to visit the Lincoln household. And he said his hand shook so horribly to remember the woman he courted in the Lincoln household that he couldn't sign the ledger book properly. And so really it's the love story of him going off to war and losing her and wandering the West for 50 years, more or less, till he finds her again. So I love that sweeping arc. And I do like those Love in the Time of Cholera stories where people are split up for their lifetime. And somebody pointed out, well, you're married to someone you met when you were really much younger, and now you're married to him. And I thought, oh yeah, I didn't even put two and two together. But so it's a love story, but it's also about American generosity in terms of, and it's an immigrant story that hardly anyone knows about. including people in Portugal. So I really wanted to bring that to the fore. And there's more to talk about in terms of all the things I discovered, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, now you've given me even more questions. I want to get back to this American generosity piece, because you say something in the book that I think is really interesting about sort of American history. You've got Emily Dickinson is in this book. She features, we meet Abraham Lincoln, and there's a lot of stuff that I think is really, I want to get to. But before we get there, let's stick with John and Mary.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've read the book, if you've read the acknowledgments are just filled with places you went and libraries you visited to do the research. But what was it about John and Mary, right? So it seems like, if I understand correctly, you met John through a letter that he wrote,
Mm-hmm.
and you discovered this love that he had for Mary, this woman Mary. What else did you know about him or her
That
or
was
them?
it.
Okay.
And Mary, it's fiction.
Mhm.
And she was obviously missing from his life, but I thought, what a love that must have been to, as an old man, have your hand shake so much. And in the 15 years of writing it, that kept me going, because I thought that strength of emotion was something to feed me, instead of this kind of cranky, gosh, I have to take 50 pages out of this. How do I do that sort of thing? But, when I look at the acknowledgments now, I think, who was that person who did all that? Because it just seems like I guess I did. And I kept notes about it.
You definitely did. And it comes
did.
through. Yeah. I didn't read the acknowledgments until I finished the book. And then I thought, how did you do all of this? Right. So one of the things that I wonder is, so you read this letter, it's this, there's this interesting man, that he's got this love for this woman. So you had to invent them from scratch, right? So you had the seed
Pretty
of this
much.
idea, and you had to invent them.
Pretty much.
So let's start with John. So
Mhm.
he's the male character. How did you create a story for him? And when you were doing it, how much of the history was there for you? Where was that meeting
Mhm.
between, I'm inventing some characters and I'm writing a love story, and I'm placing it in this history?
A lot of it was just stumbling around in the dark. I mean, just let's try this. Let's have him do this. And, I finally make him a teacher of the deaf, because he actually grew up in jail with his mother, who was condemned to die for heresy in Madeira. And by the way, they were taken into Illinois, just a little asterisk that's kind of important is, yes, American generosity, but things are always complicated. And they were an enormous voting bloc for the Republicans, because they were abolitionists. And they were trying to counter the Southern Democrats coming up through the south of Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
So it was complicated, as they say.
Still is.
But yes, indeed. But John, as a character, they're just feeding on that emotion of his hand trembling, signing the book to recall someone, kept me going a lot. And you dig a little bit, and fun things come to the surface. And one of those things was, I was at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, because I wrote a proposal about this idea, and I sent it to them, and they said, all right, great, you're in. And I thought, damn it, I have to do it. And he mentions at one point, or rather, I got his papers from the Veterans Administration. You can just write to them and say, could I have so-and-so's papers? And they'll send them to you. Wow. Which struck me as remarkable. But
did you have to say
no?
You just said, hey, so I could just call and say, hey, I want such and such.
I don't know if they've changed that. This is a while ago, right? Mm-hmm. So who knows? But there was a little document in there that said he had been court-martialed for 20 days. And now Drew Faust was still at the Radcliffe Institute. So I went to her and I said, what did he do? Because if he did something horrible, I'm not sure I could, I was like a teenager. I'm not sure I want this guy. And she said, I don't know, but I know I have a friend at the military records at the National Archives in Washington. Next time you're there, why don't you go have a look? And what are the odds that I walk in and there is my friend Alan Taylor from California. Now it makes more sense he's won the Pulitzer twice for history, and he's a wonderful writer. it makes sense for him to be there, but not Katherine Vaz. So he goes, Katherine? And I explained to him that I was looking to see what one soldier in the whole of the Civil War might have done to get him a 20-day incommunicado sentence. And he said, needle in a haystack. That's what everyone said. So you know where this is going. I found it within 3 hours.
Wow.
And I went and waved it under Alan's nose. It was one of the happiest moments of my life, probably. He said, look what I found. And he said, okay, so you're going to come over to the dark side, meaning history writing instead of no. I said, no, I just wanted you to know this. And so I had a lot of fun with the research in that way. And let's just say that I fell in love with my character for what he did. It's authentically in the book, his crime.
Wait, so the crime.
The crime
Okay.
that he was punished for 20 days with.
So that's what jumped out at you when you discovered him, and then you kind of built from there.
Yeah, well, I also thought if he did something really horrible, I'm not sure I want to latch onto this.
Mm-hmm.
And not only did he not, he just fall in love with what he did. I mean, these were guys who'd been through Shiloh and Vicksburg. And the Meridian Raid was something I discovered. I'm not a Civil War buff, and I didn't know it was a dry run for the March to the Sea. And I thought, what? You know, it's those writers' questions. If this was somebody who got burned out of his home on Madeira, because the riots were really horrible, he got burned out of his home, what would it be like to be in Meridian being told to burn down the houses? They razed that town. Raise is one of those words that is what quite wonderful with different spellings means the opposite. But you know, those little discoveries you make about, and you make those connections as writers,
Right.
you know, that what would it be like if he had to do this?
Well, one of the things that I took from the acknowledgments that I liked is it is where a novelist operates what happened in that blank space, what occurred between courting this woman,
Yeah.
right, and the evocation of the trembling she's still induced in his old age, which is just beautifully written anyway, but also a really interesting way to look at storytelling, right? We get an idea, how do we build it? So you've got John, he's falls in love with this woman. There are obstacles. If you've read the book, you know what they are, but we do have a love story that spans decades, spans a lifetime. What about Mary? So she was a total invention. You had her name in the letter.
Yeah.
So why did you give her, maybe tell us about her character?
Well, as you know, it's just harder to trace the history of women because, first of all, it's not written down as often. They change their names when they get married, and so I didn't know. But I thought, what kind of a person was she? There was a lot of me, I suppose, in that character.
What about you?
Just that she's very independent. She loves.
She's feisty. Are you feisty?
Not think so. Well,
In a good way. I like feisty.
No, my
Feisty's a
brother's
good
laughing.
word.
Which yeah. I think it was a way of building a female character, and I wanted to give her a complication. It's a love triangle, actually, and the challenge was to make this other man a good person.
Mm-hmm. That was a challenge, right? Because usually when you have a love triangle, especially in American storytelling, someone in the triangle is
It's
terrible,
supposed to be,
right?
yeah,
So that we can root for the lovers.
right.
Yeah.
But I thought that just seemed very easy to me to put someone in that category. Well, you write about love quadrangles, right?
Multi. Yeah, I think that there's a word for
triangle
it.
doesn't quite cover it. Double
Octagonal,
triangles,
yeah.
So, I just wanted to explore the complication of different kinds of goodness and people's flaws.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you can love someone who looks good on paper. You know, we all have had that experience, and it's different from just not having to ask yourself.
So I want to know later, because I don't want any spoilers, which one of them you think is better on paper, but you don't have to tell us now. I just want to know for my own curiosity. So the historical context, you've already started talking about that. So we begin in Madeira in 1843, and we end in the US in the early 1920s. We go through the Civil War. John fights in the Civil War. We meet Emily Dickinson, like I said, Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln. We see battles of the Civil War. So, and then I did my own research, because not only was it wonderful to read the story, it's a great story, it's beautifully written, the historical context is really interesting, but then I became curious about the sort of adjacent history. So
Yeah.
if you could sort of tell us about that story
Sure.
through why did you bring the story through that context? And I'm imagining it's because that's when it took place. But where was the fascination for you?
I mean, as you know, the danger is because you get all this wonderful research, and then you think that has to sink down below, and a lot of it has to be cut. And there are a lot of writers who that. But I think I looked at when he was born, and I saw a documentary once in which Civil War veterans with their long beards, and they were older, right before World War One, and I thought they went from the Civil War, some of them, to being witnesses of World War One, or a Great War at the time. And so, what was that like? But also the inventions. I mean, sound machines and auditory science was just starting to bloom, and those people died around the time of movies coming out. So I thought that's a fascinating one. And there was another thing that's submerged, and I wish I could just write an essay. I should write an essay about it.
You can.
And by the way, Leslie helped me a lot with the movie scene. That was her brainstorm. But there was something about American generosity at the time that when I looked at Jacksonville, where a lot of the book takes place, they were doing an experiment. They called themselves the Athens of the West. And of course, Illinois was the West at the time. And they believed in huge facilities, well-funded facilities for the blind, for the deaf, for the indigent, for all sorts of things. And they had the first college for women in the state of Illinois, and they had art galleries, and it was a feeling of boosterism and community. And Springfield had the railroads and politics, and this is simplifying, of course. But there was a war for who was going to win the heart of America, which is a war that we're still battling. So I thought that was fascinating as well.
Yeah.
And the idea that the myth of the human community was something I read about, that those guys, if they didn't make a fortune, would just go west because they were discovering gold in California. The women they left behind were called gold widows or silver widows if they went to Nevada. And there's a great novel waiting to be written about it. There were a lot of women left on their own. And there has yet to be a book that I went off on a long tributary about that until my editor said, nice, but that's another book. So you got to cut that. So I did.
Are you going to write it, or are you giving these writers
I give it away
permission?
No, I give it away freely.
There you
I'm
go.
not
If
going
you're
back to that
struggling.
era. No, I'm done. So there was a friendship triangle with a Haitian barber immigrant named Billy Flourville, who was friends with Lincoln and friends with another fellow who's Elias, forget his name. But in the acknowledgments, I say somebody else picked that up because that would be a fascinating book as well.
You've got a lot of strands that someone
A lot
could
of
grab
strands
onto
that
here.
you have to go in and cut because it's still a long book. And but I had a lot of help. When I was done, I gave it to my agent, and I thought, and she said, well, it's really great. I'm going to represent you, but I want you to work for a year with. There's this fellow who works in tandem with her. And then she sold it, and my editor said,
Wait a minute.
I love it.
Who was this guy?
His name is Randall Klein.
What did she want you to do for a year with him?
Tighten it up, shorten it.
So an editor of some sort?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so he works with Ellen Levine is her name. And then Megan Lynch bought it, and she said, I love it. It's really great. And but we're going to work for a year, tightening it and shortening it. And I really got good input from them. And she wanted me to work on the character of the second man in the book because she said,
Edward.
Edward, I want him to be an even better person than you have him. And that's a challenge because you think, even though divorce wasn't common, you want her to have a reason to stay with somebody and see that it's a good life, not just think, oh, this is better and off I go.
So that is kind of how the triangle works here, right? You've got this passionate love, right? And this love from youth, and John sort of feels kind of heroic. He's fighting in the Civil War. He seems very sexy and handsome. And then you have Edward, who is stability, right? He's grounded, but he is also attractive. I found myself going, gosh, I don't know who she should.
Well, then the problem was I
choose.
made him too attractive. So it's like, just be happy with him. He's got more money than that other guy.
It was a sign of maturity that I was like, maybe I like Edward better.
Yeah.
Usually I'd go for John.
I worked on the book for so long that Edward started looking pretty good to me.
Yeah, it looked pretty good. So then what is your spin on the love triangle and this sort of, and I love it. These are stories that we've told ourselves, for centuries, right? Star-crossed lovers, they find each other, things keep getting in their way, they find each other, and then they lose each other again. So tell us what your spin is on that really wonderful story.
I'm a sucker for those stories. I really like them. I just feel that there's a point at which the mature act of grace is giving someone up. And I wanted them to do that. And should I give it away? I mean, the
end?
No, not the very end.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a funny story about the very, very end. It is the only part of the book that I didn't change a word of. It came into my head when I was shopping at Gourmet Garage in New York City, a chain that no longer exists. And it just came into my head. And I thought, great, I finished shopping and I went home and I kind of just thinking it's the only part of the book didn't change. And so I have a special fondness for that part. But you were asking about Edward and the
So I was
sweep of it?
asking about sort of the spin you're taking on that very beloved story about lovers who come together, come apart.
Well, this is a veteran of a war, and the idea of hurting another man is abhorrent to him. And so I wanted them to be changed and not, oh, gee, this is so sad. I still love you the most. It's a little more mature. And so I wanted them to actually meet, though, in person and go through that. And sort of a touchstone. So it's not just, they need and they, I don't want to give away the end, but
yeah,
there needed to be a punctuation in it.
So, so I'm going to talk for a little second because there are some things that I'm going to share and maybe ask you to read a little bit.
Okay.
If you have your book.
Sure. I'm very, very short.
Okay. So there are qualities in the narrative that feel really distinctive. There's this reverence for nature, plants and gardening, and it features very heavily both in the characters and what happens in the story. Then the prose, I have hearts. This is my copy. I've got hearts all over it because I'm a sucker for language. I'm going to read you some stuff that I loved. The grate over the window chopped the sky into the shape of teeth. Beautiful. The meat still printed with the memory of its bones. It's kind of lying. You're like, oh man, why didn't I think of that? And then we've got a bunch of lessons that sort of come through what the characters are sharing with each other. Some of these are really cool. Never sail away without a woolen hat, because if you get lost, you can wring the mist out of it to survive on unsalted water, which is beautiful and elegant and also mysterious. Then the cure for earaches is to hold hot pancakes over your ears.
I found that out at the School for the Deaf in Jacksonville, Illinois. That place, what they welcome, that's the thing about research, that people really welcome you, and they just, it's so great we can look things up on our computers and say, oh, in 1849, June 20th was a Sunday. I mean, we all agree that's pretty great, but you have to go to a place. And when I was in Jacksonville as a guest writer what are the odds they're going to advertise for a writer to come for a semester in the very place I wanted to research? So they were so shocked I was writing about Jacksonville that I got the gig. And I met a botanist there who named Dr. Lawrence Zettler, who he was developing something called ghost orchid perfume. And I thought, what? I mean, my wildest research could not have come up with the fact that there were ghost orchids on the prairie of Illinois. I would never have invented that. And
That's
they
really
were a
cool.
real thing. I love magical realism, which I define as realism, which is that things like that. And he said, let's go find some. And I said, okay. And he found them, not me. But I didn't know what to look for quite. And oh, there they are. And it took 2 years ago, or a year ago, I met him in London because he had finally finished developing the ghost orchid perfume. And he gave me a vial of it at the Royal Horticultural Society show in London. And there's a picture of me, holding it. I wish I could tell you, I smelled it and I went into a swoon or something. It kind of smelled nondescript.
A lot of pretty flowers smell nondescript, I've noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But ghost orchid perfume, I thought it would be, like a genie coming out of the bottle. But
Yeah.
But no. But that's the kind of thing. And I was there for the hatching of the cicadas, which we don't really have in California. And these things were dropping out of the trees. And I said to him, what the hell are those? And he said, oh, he's a botanist. I was just creeped out. He said, oh, this is wonderful. You're here for the blooming of them. So research is actually putting your body in a spot and being surprised. I think that's the key to probably a lot of life, but also certainly to doing research for a novel.
So would you like to read the passage
yes.
that you chose?
All right. These are really, really short. There's a really lovely expression. Portuguese parents wish their children pink dreams in the way you would wish a child sweet dreams. So this is a passage about Mary recalling her father. Sometimes she feels as breakable as a teacup or a fragile plate that is kept in a cupboard after all the other plates in the set got broken long ago. Her father vows to protect her, and he tucks her into her feather bed while wishing her pink dreams, the Lusitanian way of granting sweet dreams. Night rest in the shade of peonies, the raptures of sunrise, the tint of the camellias that got the best of God's paintbrush. Sail into pink and seize it as yours, my living angel, my own dream incarnate. And I'll read another equally short passage, which is my reference points in my own life for California and New York. Our dad's family came from the Azores, not Madeira. But this is an image that just came into my mind because it's a way of tying up California and New York for me. Mary and her dad, that's her only parent who's raised her, is taking her to Illinois. When the steamship's wake sent out froth, Mary's heart erupted with frazzle cracks from an abiding worship of New York. And farther west, onward, there was gold pried out of crevices. She had heard Illinois was very cold and extremely flat. Perhaps the winds there were like curtains that blew all the way to California and dipped into the Pacific, where the gold had run off in rivulets. And then the curtains made of wind blew back to the center of the country, brushing gold upon everyone's head.
Nice. So then let's talk about this whole America piece. You were talking about American generosity, and then there was a line that I wanted to, again, in your acknowledgments were just like a whole other book in of itself. I just loved reading them. So you say the myth of American culture being about community rather than the ability to move on. You mentioned a book by Don Harrison Doyle, which directed a spotlight on the tug of war between individualism and commerce versus boosterism, community and charity. This theme in my novel would not exist without his work. So this is a love story for sure. But then there's also this piece. So do you want to talk about how it shows up in the book and why it was important to you to bring this piece into it?
Yeah, I had to submerge it into a lot of the feeling of the book, and so I gave John a role at the School for the Deaf, and Edward is more about commerce, I guess, and he's a botanist, but not really very skilled at it. But I think I wanted to focus on this battle for the spirit of who Americans are that goes on to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And the myth that American is this community. There was a moment when I was in the Azores once, and my godmother and I realized we were in the middle of a family battle over, I won't go into it because it's very funny, but it wasn't funny at the time, but battle over who inherited property from my dad. And we just looked at each other and said, we're American, let's just run. We just fled. And then we realized you can't run. It's not big enough to hide anywhere, right? So we realized that's the geography. Plain geography has a lot to do with the fact that we can remake ourselves. And if this didn't work, you can run off and start a new life. The men left in droves and started new lives and had new families, and the women did not. So that was interesting to me, and that idea of myth about community, I still think that is at the root of a lot of the issues that we have to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was, I think, a feeling I wanted to have in the book. But of course, since it's a novel, these are people caught in those times. It's not a essay about that, but I did want that to come through.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Every country, every culture has the mythology it's built on.
Yes.
It really feels like here we've got a ton, right? It's kind of hard to dig into it and find, who are we really, and how is this culture?
Yeah, who are we really, and what do we want to become? And they had to work at it. In Jacksonville, they were not naive. There were a lot of cattle barons who put their money for those things. They didn't build temples to themselves or to the church. They built temples to art, and I mean, Jacksonville wanted to be the model for the rest of the country, which was very moving. I got invited into people's house. I would just write to people and say, can I come visit your house? And they said, sure. And they would talk for a few hours about the history of it. And it was really quite wonderful. The women who were, or the men and women who were descendants of this community still live there. There's a place still called Madeira Hill in Jacksonville. And they gave me their old Bibles. So really the idea of, I wanted to play out the idea of community helping to tell a story as well.
Well, so speaking of going to houses, you went to Abraham Lincoln's. How did that?
Yeah, they gave me a private tour, which was really nice. I mean, you just have to ask people. And I went at when it was not open to the public, and we spent hours just sitting around and talking. And you get the feel of the place. There were pins stuck in the carpeting that had probably been there since whenever, and you get the door flingered crystal and the steepness of the stairs. And when I was doing some research, this was fun. They were so excited I was not there to check genealogy. Like my great uncle was the third pallbearer to Lincoln. They were so excited that she's a novelist. So they kept running to the vault for me. I said, can we get out the ledger that he talked about in this interview? And it was verbatim the way he described it. But they said, let's go get Mary Todd Lincoln's cookbook. I said, yeah, let's go get her cookbook. Ooh. It was stuck together in the dessert pages because she was a sugar addict. I thought, oh, this is just wonderful. This is just wonderful. I mean, I had a good time researching, and I knew enough not to get so in the weeds with it that I spent years and years and years doing it, thinking, well, that was nice. Now I have to write the book. I was writing the whole way along too.
So you could do one of those Julia and Julia books where you make the recipes from Mary Todd Lincoln's cookbook.
Oh, that's a
There's a whole other book.
A lot of them are pretty I mean, it's very 19th century cooking, like 2 pounds of sugar and 4 drops of cochineal, which is, do you know what cochineal is? It's a fuchsia dye that is made from crushing the bodies of cochineal insects. And it's used as a clothing dye, but also food coloring. So I thought, I know this is, you're supposed to be stricter about this, but I have to put that in because that's, wow. If they have pink cake at the Lincoln household, they're eating bugs, which I thought was
wow.
good.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
History. Okay, so I'm keeping track of time, so I'm going to turn it over to you for questions in just a second. So let them come to you. So the book took 15 years, you said, to write. And then I saw this line, you were looking in John's papers and he'd written, "I have no one to care for me." Is that why you were like, "Oh, I'll do it. I'll write."
That is exactly what
Yeah.
happened. When I got the Veterans Administration papers,
Mhm.
it was, I swear this is true. I'd been on the phone with my friend Varley O'Connor, who I said, I don't think I want to do this. I know I'm at the Radcliffe Institute, but and she said, Catherine, just go home. Tomorrow's another day. Just go home. And the Veterans Administration said, you have to wait 3 months to get these. It was waiting for me about 3 days after I'd asked for it. It was waiting for me in the foyer of my apartment building. And I opened it, and the first thing I saw was him typing a letter as an old man saying, I have no one to care for me. I thought, okay, all right. I mean, that scared me, kind of like, oh, okay, all right. So I went back to that. And, speaking of the acknowledgments, the saying, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time, applies to those acknowledgments because they go on. And I thought I just had to do them, and I was exhausted with the whole thing. My husband said, you've been saying it was 15 years for 2 years now. You have to say 17. So,
yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to you, but here's the last question that I have for you. So when we were talking about doing this lovely event, I asked you if there's anything you wanted to talk about, and you hinted that you have cool stories because your husband, father or grandfather, father was a founder or co-founder of Random House.
Yes.
Major publishing house. And you have some stories that you said you could share.
I have
for all of these writers and people who like
tons
great
of
literary stories.
Many of them very funny. I'll just tell you a quick one because it's quite wonderful. Bennett Cerf was he was on television, and if you saw What's My Line, that was my father-in-law. And it seems like he was
on the show, or
he was on the show. He's one of the regular panelists on What's My Line.
Okay.
And they, when you're growing up in California, you think they seem so erudite and so elegant and smart and I didn't know I'd marry his son when I was grown up. And he had such fun. It was a different era.
Well, wait, so who was he that he was a panelist on that? Was that the show where like they write their name on the chalkboard and then they come out?
The mystery guest would come out,
like
sign
movie
the name.
Stars and stuff, right?
Yeah. And
yeah.
Apparently my father-in-law would check the newspapers to see who might be in town because they would get on the show and that would help him guess. Oh, how did he guess that?
Oh, that's it. So it's Marilyn Monroe, and they're asking questions.
Salvador Dali was there once, and
yeah, I remember that.
But
I don't remember it. But
he was kind of the glamorous person, and he had a money person with him. There are a lot of stories to tell, but just for the interest of time, I'll just the publication of Ulysses is quite wonderful. But he was friends with Gertrude Stein, and he wrote one of the jacket copy. I have no idea what Gertrude is writing about, but she says that's because I'm an idiot. So I hope you can figure this out, Bennett. And he was so smart about publicity. There was, I forget the name of the young, beautiful woman who was the author of Forever Amber. You have to be old enough to have remembered that book. There was this big romantic thing. Somebody told me, it's really not that salacious. Nobody ever actually does it in the book, but was supposed to be very scandalous. And she, Publishers Weekly, she's, on the cover. And so Bennett got Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas to wear fur coats and smoke cigars. And he got the cover like the next week saying, we got our glamour girls too. So that's a cool story. And they briefly, when he published Ulysses, Random House was really young and it was really small, and he paid $5,000 for that.
Wow.
And he went and talked James Joyce into it. And of course, as you all know, it was banned in the US, and he didn't want to risk it rotting in a warehouse and investing $5,000, which was a lot at the time, and having it go nowhere. So they arranged for a copy to be smuggled with reviews pasted in the copy, because you could only enter into evidence the copy that was contraband itself. You couldn't quote reviews. So he had these reviews pasted in. And it happened to be a really, really hot day in New York going through customs. And so the customs official was just waving people through. And the guy assigned to get arrested was getting nervous. And they waved him through. He said, no, I'm an American citizen. I insist you check my bags. And he said, just go, man. And he said, no, I know my rights. And so we opened it up, and he saw the copy of Ulysses, and he said, oh, we don't care about that. Everyone brings it in. Go ahead. And he goes, no, I insist you arrest me. And they did. And he timed it so there'd be a very liberal judge who would be hearing the case, and the rest is history.
That's a lot of really great name dropping. You got Ulysses, you've got, and I'm also curious. So there was a time where a publisher was successful and famous enough that they could be on a primetime game show.
Well, yes,
I
because
mean,
he saw this thing called television. He said, what a great way to advertise books.
Wow. Can you imagine? A lot of our lives would be very different if that were still the case.
Yeah, and there were writers who would say, oh my God, that's so tacky of you. And then they would call him up and complain if he didn't mention them. So.
What questions do you have for Katherine? Books, New York, California, research.
I have one mention to make because Laura has a lot of friends here. Her wonderful book, Sweet Sloth Plenty Rhythm, is been out in paperback a while now. And she also is a master of very human love stories, which, as you pointed out, there's much made of trying to get the villain. And Circus Palmer, your star, it's all tied into his kind of success as a jazz musician, but he hasn't gotten where he is, and it's reflected in his love life. But nobody's a villain in the book. And the women are not all strong and independent and dealing with it well, the way there's an impulse to do that now too, with women being
everybody has to be empowered and have complete agency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're just human.
Yeah.
So it's just a wonderful
thank
book.
you. That's very nice of you to say.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that it's more interesting to me when you have a love triangle and everyone is potentially desirable.
But you do more that you do like triple triangles, which is really, really great.
Yeah, when you have a jazz musician at the center, there's just
exactly.
not two.
Yeah. But he's really sympathetic.
Thank you. Not everybody feels that way, but thank you.
Really, I thought that it's so tied into how he feels about how he expresses himself in music, and that he's successful, but not according to his dreams. And so he backs away from fully loving or but he's got a big heart, I think.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And it's funny when you're writing characters who
and he
are
has a
supposed
daughter.
to be challenging.
And he has a daughter. And Maggie's great. And anyway, it was very refreshing in that there's such an impulse now to do I think flatter.
Yeah. And that was something that I appreciated about your book too, because I think you're right. And there are a lot of writers here, and when you're writing characters, there does feel sometimes like there's that expectation, like somebody's got to be bad, so we know who or what to root for, right? Yeah. But real life doesn't really usually work that way.
Yeah, right? I had the benefit of something like Civil War. Making a lot of badness, and I got really good advice from my editor, by the way, about that, because those war scenes were twice as long as they ended up being,
and they're brutal. You did a really great job of
that's what people have told me. And my editor said,
not brutal to read, but
we know war is hell. Tell me something I don't know. And one of the gruesome details of Shiloh that I had not really read very much about, but it makes sense because it was a wooded area, is that animals would come out and eat the dead and dying. And so I thought, and also after the battle, and this has been written about, but you don't see it a lot, is that people would come and scavenge stuff. And so I thought those two go together. Those two things go together. So those war scenes are half of what they were, because I thought, I know better, but the research about where they set up a breastwork with their troop, and I had it all, but I thought, just get rid of it.
Yeah, those scenes were very, very powerful to read.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
Why did you feel that you wanted to go into that much detail on the battle scenes?
A compulsive need to use my research, even though I knew I shouldn't. even though I knew I shouldn't. And I guess I wanted to bolster the sense that it was authentic, because I'm not a Civil War buff. I didn't. And so maybe it was a little insecurity at first before I got rid of that. And I'm much happier with it, all that cleared away.
Can I ask you a question about, the book covers multiple decades, covers a massive amount of territory. Besides trimming some of the tangents, what were the techniques you tried to use to maintain narrative drive, to get it to go all the way to the end?
I want to do better to answer that than just saying raw instinct. Just to keep saying to myself, what are the connective threads in terms of not theme but action? What is the consequence of somebody keeping them up? There are evil people in the book. What's the consequence of somebody doing something truly horrible to these people? How do they find that out? And I tried to just jump on the stones getting me across the river and not get caught up in the rushing of it and the detailing, because I tend to get submerged in details. But I think it was the impetus of, if you were going to describe in a treatment what the action is, what would you say next?
Right.
Yeah. And it was what are the overarching, what are the long-term things? Not just will these two get together again, but what are the obstacles that complicate how they can get together? And to me, another, I guess, human discovery was who are the bad guys? And they're not soldiers. Mary has her own battles in the social sphere, and that ends up being the most dangerous territory of all, because I think human beings have their jealousies and warfares that I think it's just on the scale of actual warfare. So that was an important theme for me also. Did that answer?
Yeah.
John is a master of storytelling, so I'm answering nervously.
That was great.
Yeah, okay.
We had a question.
Oh yeah, I'm just wondering if you, with all your research and pulling everything together, do you worry about authenticity, or how do you kind of test that, and where do you give yourself license to veer off from,
Yeah, that's a really good question, because of course, I mean, I guess my rule that I called it, don't put zippers in the 19th century. In other words, you can't invent certain things. You can't have somebody zipping their dress up in 1850. And, I did so much research that in fact, most people made their own clothes, and there were starting to be newly made dresses. And this was a wonderful detail that train robberies would sometimes demand that trunks be opened, and they would take the dresses to give them to people to manufacture, mass produce. That's hilarious. I mean, open that trunk, lady, and yeah, I'll take that and that. That's hilarious. But to answer your question better is the license of what a person might do in the era seems like open territory. The constrictions of authenticity had to stay within the era. In other words, Jacksonville had all these institutions for the blind, the indigent, and that was a real thing. So I couldn't put those in Springfield. There were just certain boundaries with the truth, because you never want people to stop and say, well, that didn't happen then, or that. But in terms of what would a woman do who was trying to sell something in 1850, it would be unusual to have her own bank account. I would have to make sure that people know that that's not a usual thing. I don't think people totally realize women up until 1970 couldn't have their own credit card, I think. Is that? Yeah, thank you. Everyone's nodding. So certain authentic things. But then I like the idea that creativity is produced when strictures exist. The way a sonnet, you have to put the world in a sonnet, and it's very things. So I guess that was my rule, and it was don't put zippers in the 19th century. And even with that, I did get, this is the blessing of copy editors. they will say, do you mean, and you think, yes, thank you. I made the mistake in an early draft of writing World War I instead of the Great War. And it made me cringe, but that got caught, so. Did that answer properly? Okay.
And Pam, you're next. Oh, sorry.
do you want to? No. Go ahead.
Pamela, go ahead.
Okay, when you work on a book over such a long period of time, I mean, my experience is that you're influenced, you become a different writer
Yes.
over that period. And I just wonder what things happened in your life, what things you read, what things you watched that kind of changed the direction of the book or influenced the book in some
Well,
way.
I can answer that in a very personal way. Both my parents died. My dad, we were figuring out 11 years ago, and my mother, unfortunately, right before it came out. I thought that'll be the first book I don't get a nice long letter from her. So that changed me in terms of the impetus to keep going and finish it, to give that some meaning. My father wrote a lot about the history of the Portuguese in America, and so it was important to me to make this contribution to the understanding of a lot of the immigration. I didn't even know this immigration story, and it's a big one. It's not like a few dozen people. There were a lot of them who came there. So that was important to me, and just stopping every now and then and saying, stop thinking about what happens next in the book, or you've got to finish 50 pages by the end of this month. Fall back in love with them, or it's not going to work. So that was the things that kept me, I guess, going. And some of them were harder. And we're a different person when we finish a book that took only 2 years. So 15, I just feel like all my cells have been replaced twice. Yeah. It's Samira.
Samina, yeah.
Samina.
Thank you. It's a similar question, but it was something about how your own family history informed, and did you then feel compelled to do even more research on, especially now with your parents not being here?
Yeah. Well, my dad's family is from the Azores, not Madeira,
Right,
but that was part of. I kind of I'm fascinated by island culture and the kind of thinking it creates. And they went from this very small, Madeira's small and has a big British influence, but they went to Illinois where the prairie was flat. Madeira, if you've ever been there, it's just jaggedly, you can see someone that far across the room and you can't get to them because there's a big chasm between you. And they had a whistling language to go far. Things like that fascinate me, and you can't escape. You're forced to deal with who you are and where you are, and you can't escape. And that's an interesting premise, the way a murder mystery, you keep everyone in the same big castle and there's a storm outside and you got to figure it out. I think of island culture like that. But it was important to me because, my work is the first that's been recorded for the archives as in the Library of Congress. And so it was important to me to make that kind of, I always think it's going to be my last one, but I don't know, contribution about, nobody's writing really about the Portuguese in America, and there are a lot of them. So that to me was important. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Other questions? Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
you.
Allison? Yeah.
Such a long commitment to the work. Was there a time something in the research broke you in some way?
That's a really good question. Allison was a finalist for the National Book Award for poetry, so this is, I knew she'd ask me a tough question. Yeah, I've already mentioned it, but the trembling hand, that broke me. Like, what kind of love was it?
Yeah.
That is, and our culture is so much about being sensible and getting over things, and time has moved on, and we all know it doesn't, but we say that, and we think maturity is being able to move on and get over things and to progress. And the fact that he didn't, I was very moved by, and cheering him on as a person for that broke me. And I think when my dad died, because it was, now over a decade. I didn't work on this for about a year. So I'm going to move one of those extra years my husband talks about and put it in that year, so call it 16. But I think personal things and just the feeling more of the passage of time, because I went from being in my 50s into my 60s, and I thought, oh, okay. I'm not going to say I get it, but just that feeling of, the other thing that broke me in the book was when Mary's father dies. I gave that away, sorry. But that too. Yeah. And the other thing was, what would it be like to know you're going to say goodbye to somebody? That's important. There's a wonderful Portuguese word called saudade, which is everyone has it, but they're very proud of the fact that they have a word for it. And it means the kind of longing that's such that an absence is your biggest presence. And it defines something that you're missing someone you still have. I mean, so I guess that feeling of saudade, that it would come up every now and then. And I wish I could say that when I was done with the book, I mourned them and I thought I have postpartum depression and all the rest. And I thought, I was relieved. I thought, okay, you guys are done now. I didn't have any of that. So, but I think some personal things like that, but also that trembling hand.
That's great. So you were mentioning that there are a lot of Portuguese American stories. Are there Portuguese American or even Portuguese authors you could recommend to us that you love? You?
There aren't any. There's some. Who? There's Frank Gaspar and Alves.
Oh, I know him. Frank Gaspar?
Okay, Frank Gaspar.
I think I know
Poet.
him.
Yeah, he's a poet. He's
Okay.
in LA. Yeah, Frank Gaspar.
Okay, I'm going to say hi.
Millicent Accardi. She's a great poet who's in Los Angeles. Laura Goulart is a bit up the coast, and she writes beautiful poetry also. Allison. Who else?
We have newly emerging,
Newly emerging.
thanks to Catherine.
Yeah,
You are leading the
I teach a
charge.
workshop not every, but often in Lisbon in a program called Disquiet. And those of you who are writers who might have students or friends, it's not just Lisbon writers and Portuguese writers. It's Dennis Johnson was there, and he loved Lisbon so much he came back again, and that was great. Mary Gateskill was there so there are a lot of interesting workshops that happen.
One question just on that. You talked about liking island culture and appreciating that, and Madeira being separate from Portugal proper, right? My family is from Madeira. And so that was always a point of like, we're not.
Oh, are you Madeiran?
We're from Madeira.
Madeira, yeah.
It was basically all the peoples from different islands that were volcanic soil. They came to Hawaii, which is where I'm from, right?
Yeah.
So, but my question was just basically like, when they all came to the U.S., were they just kind of integrated into like a larger diaspora of Portuguese and kind of lumped together, or did like Madeira have its own kind of identity still?
They did, because they were isolated, and they were mostly, not just in Illinois, but they were very concentrated in Illinois. And I'm originally from California, and that has the largest Portuguese population in the United States, but not concentrated. So San Jose, Bay Area, San Diego, where a lot of tuna fishermen were. Mendocino, the valley towns, Tulare, Turlock, Stockton. That has a lot. You go back there and you see Our Lady of Fatima shrines in every yard. So yeah, and funny story about my dad. He was first in his family to go to college. He went to Cal and had raised a family with 6 kids and was a beloved high school teacher. In fact, one of his former students is right here.
Wow.
Yeah, Jack Jason, who works with Marlene Matlin. And our relatives in the valley towns do that immigrant thing of buying a little piece of land with their, what they made in the dairy and thing. And then the California land boom hit in the 70s, and a lot of them made a lot of money. And my dad said, well, I guess I showed them, didn't I? So, but I think Madeirans are very proud of being from that. And of course, it's a big mix with British culture as well there, which the Azores don't have in the same way. So the Madeirans were Protestants when they came to Illinois. And that got them in somewhat, because there was a very much anti-Catholic feeling, of course, in the mid-19th century here. So, but they fit in because they had some inkling of certainly the language, and they were Protestants.
This book is a history that it's just fascinating. We're going to have a lot of conversations after this because I have a lot of other questions.
Oh, good.
But are there any other questions for Catherine this evening?
Well, I want to thank Laura she prepared this so beautifully.
nerdy.
And
I nerd.
wow.
I would like to get to the point. I have friends who can do this without notes. Not me.
Notes are good.
Yeah, I
You know,
like
because we all know the ones where you can tell somebody hasn't finished the book and they just
Right.
got a thing, and you've read,
Right.
not only read it, but just you expressed such affection for it. So I'm really
it was
grateful.
a real joy. I'm very glad to be here with you.
I'm delighted as well. And
Thanks.
you did a great job.
So you're going to sign books?
I shall, and so will Laura.
Okay.
We have plenty of books to purchase. We'll be signing.
Great for
Thank
dads
you.
and grads.
That's
It's
right.
June.
So, that's right. Dads and grads.
Dads and grads.